One of the issues that was raised during the Jack the Ripper scare was whether the constant and unrestrained reporting of the Whitechapel atrocities in the newspapers was having a detrimental effect on the impressionable minds and behaviour of young people and children. Reforms in education had resulted in the population at large becoming more literate, and some publishers were catering for the tastes of the expanding reading public with a proliferation of cheap sensationalist literature, the focus of which was very much on criminals, supernatural entities, and blood-spattered tales. Although penny dreadfuls, as these publications were disparagingly known, had been around since the 1830s, their number and readership, which consisted mainly of young men and teenagers, increased dramatically from the 1860s onwards, and by the 1880s more than 1 million of them were being sold weekly. Their popularity, especially with the young, led to a massive backlash from moralists, and the debate as to whether or not reading this type of fiction could inspire the young to commit similar crimes themselves had been raging for many years by the time the Jack the Ripper murders began. An article that appeared in the Wilts and Gloucestershire Standard on Saturday the 13th of October 1888 opined, "We put it to any unprejudiced observer to say whether the rising generation of board school children are not distinguished from the children of our early days by an increase of pertness and self-sufficiency of manner, coupled with just so much greater facility of reading power as enables them to revel in the corrupting literature of the penny dreadfuls, which are selling by millions a week." In July 1888, Bensley Cyrus Lawrence, the timekeeper of the Baltic sawmills in Tunbridge Wells, Kent, was shot dead. When in the October of that year the perpetrators of the crime were finally arrested, people were shocked to learn that they were 2 teenage boys, 19-year-old William Gower and 17-year-old Charles Joseph Dobell. Even more shocking was the fact that the 2 boys showed absolutely no remorse for their crime. In fact, they seemed to revel in the notoriety the murder had afforded them, and Gower, when asked if he was sorry, had replied that if their victim were to rise from the grave, they would do it again. According to the Bury and Norwich Post on Tuesday the 23rd of October, upon Dobell were found copies of a sensational publication. It is to the perusal of this kind of reading that the ruin of the lads is ascribed, for in all their malpractices there has been present a spirit of bravado. It is reported that when in the dock they were so callous that they told the police that they had better charge for admission to the court. At the trial, it was revealed that on the 27th of September, Dobell had stopped a boy near the offices of the Tunbridge Wells Advertiser and had asked him to deliver a letter to the paper. The writer of that letter claimed that he was the one who had fired the fatal shot, and he asked for space in the paper to correct certain inaccuracies that had been made at the inquest into Bensley Lawrence's death. The letter was signed, "Another Whitechapel Murderer." Ultimately, the 2 were found guilty of murder, and they were executed on the morning of Wednesday the 2nd of January 1889. However, their attitude at their trial, their evident lack of remorse, coupled with the fact that they had been avid readers of penny dreadfuls, reignited the debate over the part played by violent literature in corrupting the minds of the young. Since this was around the time that the press coverage of the Whitechapel murders was going into overdrive, many of the campaigners against violent literature began to regard such coverage as being on a par with the corrupting sensationalism of the penny dreadfuls. The release of the Dear Boss letter in early October had given the perpetrator of the crimes a name that could have come straight from the pages of a penny dreadful, and it wasn't long before Jack the Ripper had joined the likes of Dick Turpin, Spring Heel Jack and Sweeney Todd, and had become an almost mythical character, and soon his actions were being emulated by adults and children alike. The Batley Reporter and Guardian on Saturday the 17th of November reported, "A correspondent writes that it has become quite common for children to play at Whitechapel murder, boys taking the character of Jack the Ripper and girls being the victims. This sort of thing goes on nightly instead of the ordinary amusement of little boys and girls, and he truly says it is horrible to think of and a great reflection upon the parents." He adds that even the grown-up are affected by the craze, and that the horrible details of the several outrages are made the subject of frequent conversation, the children, little and big, listening eagerly. Inevitably, the propensity amongst the young to play at Jack the Ripper came very close to ending in tragedy when one of these children's games went a little too far. The Hendon and Finchley Times on Friday the 14th of December reported on the appearance in court of 12-year-old Oliver Thorne, who was charged with having stabbed 8-year-old Edward Govier during a playtime game at the British schools in Hendon. Since Edward Govier was still suffering from the effects of his injuries, he was not in a fit state to appear in court that day, and Inspector Browning presented a medical certificate to that effect. Edward's mother told the court that although he was recovering, the night before she was certain he was going to die. The magistrate asked if there was anybody present who knew how the incident had happened. Mr. Butler, master at the school, explained that the boys were scholars at that school and that on Tuesday they had been playing Jack the Ripper together. The knife happened to be open at the time and had penetrated the boy's chest. The magistrate asked if it had been done in a fit of temper. Mr. Butler replied that, so far as he was able to gather, the boys were playing. The knife opened and the wound was inflicted by Thorne. Since the Whitechapel murders, the boys would play these violent games, although he did all in his power to stop them. The injured boy's garments were then produced by P.C. Bowes. These were saturated with blood. The magistrate remarked that the lad must have lost a quantity of blood. The prisoner's father said that a little blood made a great show on anything white. Mr. Butler said that he was given to understand that the cut was about 1/4 of an inch long and had been produced by an ordinary pocket knife. Oliver Thorne was remanded for a week on his father's recognizance. On Friday, the 21st of December, the Hendon and Finchley Times reported on Thorne's next court appearance before magistrates Mr. Johnston and Mr. Fortnum. Oliver Thorne, schoolboy of Hendon, was charged with wilfully wounding Edward Govier, 8 years old, by stabbing him with a knife in the playground of the British schools Hendon. Mr. Lovett prosecuted and Mr. A.W. Tuttle defended. Mr. Lovett, in opening the case, said that it appeared that on the 11th of December, Edward Govier, James Clark and William Dean were scholars at the Hendon British schools. After they were dismissed, they were consulting in the playground at midday what game they should play when Thorne went up and proposed a game called Jack the Ripper. Before Govier could say anything, Thorne got hold of him, dragged him into the vestibule where the hats were hung up, laid him on a trestle, knelt upon him, took a knife from his pocket and stabbed him on the shoulder. Prior to stabbing the boy, he flourished the knife about. James Clark took Govier's coat off to see what was the matter because he called for his mother and found him bleeding. Thorne offered him a chain to say nothing about what had occurred. The prisoner had been accused previously in the neighbourhood of indecent behaviour. William Edward Govier, 8 years old, was then called and said that he lived at Hendon. He was at the British schools on the 11th of December. The defendant was there. James Clark and Dean were there also. They were playing with Thorne in the playground. It was a little after 12 o'clock. Thorne said, "I am Jack the Ripper," then pulled him into the lobby. Here he threw the witness over some trestles and sat upon him. The witness could not see whether he had a knife in his hand because his face was downwards. While there, a knife came bash into him. Thorne said, "Don't go and tell teacher," and offered him a chain not to say anything. They were not bad friends before this occurrence. A doctor had been attending him since. On being questioned by Mr. Tuttle, he explained that before playing Jack the Ripper, they had been playing Buffalo Bill. They caught one another in that game, and the one captured was placed in the lobby. While playing Buffalo Bill, they did not fire a pistol off. He had not played Jack the Ripper before this occasion. Before he was thrown onto the trestles, he ran about the playground, which was part of the game of Jack the Ripper. It was usual to put the one caught into the lobby. The prisoner knelt upon him and then sat upon him, and as he got up, he felt the stab. The shock passed right down to his feet. He had never seen a knife used before, although they had played this game. James Clark of 8 Chatterbox Row, Golders Green, said that he was a scholar at the British schools. He remembered Tuesday the 11th. After they came out of school, the witness proposed a game of buffaloes, but Thorne said, "No, let's play Jack the Ripper." Before Govier could say yes, Thorne collared him and took him into the lobby. He then got a trestle, laid it on the floor, and put Govier on the trestle, face towards the ground. Thorne knelt upon him and said, "Now I've got you." He then took his pocket knife out and told Govia that he would cut his hair, and he began to cut it. Afterwards he moved the knife about, and it accidentally struck Govia on the breast. He cried out, "Mother!" The witness and dean went to his assistance and rolled Thorn off the trestle. Govia went into one corner, and the witness took his waistcoat off. Another boy went to tell the teacher. Thorn offered the boys something not to tell anybody. He could not say whether Thorn and Govia were on good terms. When they played this game, the boys usually had a piece of wood which they flourished in a similar way. In answer to a question from Mr. Tootle, he said that he did not think that Thorn had intended to injure Govia. It was a common game, and it always terminated in a stabbing scene, but this was done with a piece of wood. It was not part of the game to lay the boys on a trestle and kneel upon them. William Dean of 22 Bellevue Terrace remembered Thorn stabbing Govia. When they left school, 3 of them were going to play Buffalo Bill, but Thorn asked Govia to play Jack the Ripper. Govia agreed to play with him. Thorn caught Govia, placed him on a trestle, took out his knife, and cut his hair. The witness did not see Thorn stab Govia because he left the lobby at that time. When he returned, Govia was bleeding. Mr. Johnston commented that it was strange that such a game is allowed in a school playground. Mr. Fortnum added, "It is disgraceful." Mr. Tootle contended that the assault was not intentional and remarked that some further supervision should be exercised over the boys. Mr. Fortnum said that he did not believe Thorn intended to do his little companion real hurt, but Govia's friends had got to pay the doctor's bill. It was an accident, but the boy ought to be punished for using a knife. Mr. Govia said that the boy was violent and had knocked one of his daughters about, and his wife told the bench that it was the opinion of the doctor that the knife was used with great force. Mr. Fortnum observed that this was the upshot of boys reading and hearing of these horrible crimes in Whitechapel, and he considered the schoolmaster ought to punish boys for playing such games. Mr. Butler, master of the British schools, said that he had done all in his power to stop these games. He had only seen the boys playing it once. Mr. Johnston said that there ought to be rules to prevent improper games. Turning to Mr. Butler, Mr. Fortnum observed, "This boy appears to require your special attention." Mr. Butler said that he had looked after the boy, and his father was willing to afford him every assistance. Mr. Fortnum then cautioned Thorn, and he was discharged, the magistrates considering that his parents ought to pay the costs. And so another peripheral incident related to the Whitechapel murders drew to a close, albeit the debate over whether violent literature could influence criminal behaviour would continue. Throughout the 1890s and on into the 20th century, further violent crimes, the perpetrators of which were young boys who had been avid consumers of cheap sensational literature, would from time to time reignite the debate over whether their aggressive behaviour had been caused by their favoured type of reading matter. And to an extent, the debate is still going on today, although the argued over material has moved from the page to the screen, with computer games and online depictions of violence now being seen as the culprits in the corruption of the young. As for the protagonists in this saga, they simply retook their places in obscurity, and their names, if remembered at all, are now little more than footnotes in one of history's most infamous and pored-over crime sprees. The story is not a major piece in the puzzle of who the perpetrator of the crimes was, nor does it shed any real light on the murders themselves. It does, however, demonstrate the way in which, once the newspaper coverage of the Whitechapel atrocities gathered momentum, and the Dear Boss letter imbued the miscreant with a name that any penny dreadful publisher would have been proud of, the killer was able to permeate the consciousness of all layers and ages of society at large in a way that no murderer had done before, and in which no murderer has done since. As this case, which could so easily have ended in tragedy, demonstrates, by December 1888, Jack the Ripper had become an almost mythical figure, and thereafter it would prove all but impossible to separate the myth from the reality of the Whitechapel murders.